So I think we'll just get started. I'd like to introduce for the first week Glen Coulthard, who is on the UBC Faculty of Political Science and First Nation Studies. He's Yellowknives Dene First Nation. So I ask you to join me in welcoming Glen.
Also like to start by, of course, acknowledging that we are on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish Nation. So we should all acknowledge that and pay our respects. So I learned, I guess 2 days ago, that I was supposed to be providing a lecture. So we have some readings on some work that I've done, but also I'm going to try and link this work on recognition and my reading of Frantz Fanon in order to make sense of this turn to, or this language or discourse of reconciliation that has come to dominate Aboriginal policy circles and how we think about self-determination for Indigenous peoples here in Canada. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work through this talk. It's a work in progress. It's part of a book that I've been writing for way too long now. It's almost done. So I think the ideas are fairly thought through. I'll speak for about 40 minutes, and then I hope to open it up for a productive conversation. So on June 11th, 2008, the Conservative Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, issued an official apology on behalf of the Government of Canada to Indigenous survivors of the Indian residential school system. This was characterized as the inauguration of what he called a new chapter in the history of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal relations. The residential school policy was a highly anticipated and emotionally charged event for many, including myself, I would say. Across the country, Native and non-Native people alike gathered in living rooms, churches, community halls, and First Nations band offices to witness and pay homage to what was characterized as a, quote, historic occasion. Although there was a great deal of skepticism by both Native and non-Native people alike toward the apologies in the days leading up to it, in its immediate aftermath, it appeared that many, if not perhaps most, observers felt that Harper's apology was a genuine and necessary first step on the long road to forgiveness and reconciliation. Now, since the 1980s, a global industry has emerged promoting the issuing of official apologies, advocating forgiveness and reconciliation as an important precondition for resolving the deleterious social impacts of intrastate violence, mass atrocity, and historical injustice. Originally, the reconciliation industry was developed in state contexts which sought to undergo a formal transition from the violent history of openly authoritarian regimes to more democratic forms of rule, which is known in the literature as transitional justice. More recently, however, it has been imported to stable liberal democratic settler states like Australia and now Canada. In Canada, we have witnessed this relatively recent reconciliation politics converge with a slightly older politics of recognition, advocating the institutional recognition and accommodation of Indigenous cultural difference as an important means of reconciling the colonial relationship between Indigenous peoples and the state. So in Canada, reconciliation tends to be invoked in three distinct yet interrelated ways when deployed in the context of Indigenous peoples' struggles for self-determination. First, reconciliation is frequently used to refer to the diversity of individual and/or collective practices that Indigenous peoples undertake to reestablish a positive relation to self in situations where this relationship has been damaged or distorted by some form of symbolic and/or structural violence. Being afforded due recognition by another subject or subjects is often said to play a fundamental role in facilitating reconciliation in this first sense. And I'm thinking here of people like Charles Taylor and Axel Honneth. Second, reconciliation is also commonly referred to the act of restoring estranged or damaged social and political relationships. It is frequently inferred by proponents of political reconciliation that restoring these relationships require that individuals and groups work to overcome the debilitating anger and resentment that frequently persist in the wake of being injured or harmed by a perceived or real injustice. In settler state context, truth and reconciliation commissions, coupled with state arrangements that seek to recognize and accommodate Indigenous identity-related differences, are viewed as an important institutional means to facilitate reconciliation in these first two senses. These institutional mechanisms are also seen as a crucial way to help evade the cycles of violence and revenge that can occur when societal differences are openly suppressed or ignored, and when so-called negative emotions like anger and resentment are left to fester within and between disparate social groups. The third notion of reconciliation, commonly invoked in the Canadian context, refers to the process by which things are brought, quote, to agreement, concord, or harmony, the fact of being made consistent or compatible. And that's the definition, or one of the definitions provided by the Oxford English Dictionary. As Dale Turner's recent work reminds us, this third form of reconciliation, namely the act of rendering things consistent, is the one that lies at the core of Canada's legal and political understanding of the term. That is, rendering consistent Indigenous assertions of nationhood with the state's own assertion of sovereignty over Native peoples' lands and populations. It will be shown that this, or I'll suggest that this, Canada's commitment to impose this third form of reconciliation on the field of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal relations is undermining the realization of reconciliation in the first two senses. To my mind, Thomas Broodholm's recent work, which many of you have now skimmed over or read, offers an important critique of the turn to reconciliation politics that has emerged globally over the last 30 years. More specifically, Broodholm's study provides a much-needed counterpoint to what he calls the, quote, near-hegemonic status afforded the logic of forgiveness in literatures on transitional justice and reconciliation. Focusing on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa, Broodholm shows how advocates of transitional justice often base their normative assumptions about the supposed good of forgiveness and reconciliation on a number of uncritical assumptions about the presumed bad of harboring so-called reactive emotions like anger and resentment. Namely, that these feelings are physically and mentally unhealthy, irrational, retrograde, and when collectively expressed, prone to producing increased social instability and even violence. Broodholm challenges these assumptions through, to my mind, a fascinating engagement with the writings of essayist and Holocaust survivor Jean Emery, whose own work challenges the hegemonic portrayal of ressentiment as a vengeful, reactionary, and backward-looking mode of comportment by Friedrich Nietzsche and on the genealogy of morals. According to Broodholm, the importance of Emery's work is that it forces us to consider that under certain conditions, a disciplined maintenance of our outrage and resentment in the wake of historical injustice can signify the, quote, reflex expression of a moral protest that is as permissible and admirable as the posture of forgiveness. So in my discussion today, I undertake a similar line of argumentation, although with two significant differences. First, as a critique of the field and practice of transitional justice, Broodholm's study is limited to the, quote, aftermath of mass atrocities and to the, quote, time after the violence has been brought to official end. In my project, the political importance of Indigenous peoples' emotional reactions to colonialism is instead explored against the non-transitional backdrop of the state's approach to reconciliation that began to implicitly emerge after the 1969 White Paper on Federal Indian Policy, which I'll discuss in a bit, and explicitly following the release of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report in 1996. I argue that in settler colonial contexts, where there's no period marking a clear or formal transition from an authoritarian history to a democratic present, state-sanctioned approaches to reconciliation must ideologically fabricate such a transition by representing the abuses of settler colonization as being rooted firmly in the past. In such contexts, reconciliation becomes framed temporally as the individual and collective process of overcoming the subsequent legacy of this past abuse, but not the abusive structure itself. And what are we to think of those who refuse to forgive and or reconcile in such situations? They are typically classed as being saddled by the corrosive emotional residue of this legacy, of which anger and resentment are frequently identified. So that's my first difference. The second difference is that my argument uses the work of Frantz Fanon as my theoretical starting point instead of Jean Emery. Fanon held a very nuanced perspective on both the positive and negative aspects of Indigenous peoples' anger and resentment when expressed within and against the subjective and structural features of colonial power. In suggesting this, however, I do not deny the possibility that these at times hostile emotions can manifest themselves in profoundly disempowering ways. Rather, what I will defend are the following two claims. First, even when seemingly problematic expressions of Indigenous anger and resentment emerge, they may nonetheless represent an entirely understandable and even legitimate response to a settler colonial structure that still violently conditions our relations to self, our relations with others, and our relationships to the land. And second, instead of simply legitimizing what is still represented here as an understandable yet unhealthy reaction to colonization, I argue that under certain circumstances, proactively embracing our individual collective resentment can prompt the forms of self-affirmative praxis that produce decolonized Indigenous subjectivities and forms of life in ways that the combined politics of recognition and reconciliation has proven itself structurally incapable of doing. So I'll start with problematizing recognition. So now that this lengthy framing of my argument is out of the way, I want to briefly recap some of my previous work on a neo-colonial function of recognition-based approaches to reconciliation that began to emerge in Canada after 1969. Rather than transforming the colonial relationship in any significant sense, I argue that the hegemonization or rise to dominance of a recognition-based approach to questions of Indigenous state reconciliation following the publication and eventually shelving of the Canadian government's so-called white paper on Indian policy has simply prompted a shift in the mode of operation of settler colonial power in Canada since 1969. In the 2 decades or centuries, leading to this historic policy proposal, which called for the blanket assimilation of the status Indian population by unilaterally removing all aspects of legal and political difference that distinguishes First Nations from non-Native Canadians under the Indian Act, the reproduction of the colonial relationship between Indigenous peoples and the state depended heavily on the deployment of state power geared around genocidal practices of forced exclusion and assimilation. Virtually every colonial policy during this period, from residential schools to the sexist removal of Indian women from their land and communities, sought to marginalize Indigenous peoples and communities with the ultimate goal being our elimination. If not physically, then as cultural, political, and legal peoples distinguishable from the rest of Canadian society. These initiatives reflect the more or less unconcealed, unilateral, and coercive nature of colonial rule during most of the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, while recognizing that our people and communities have always resisted these oppressive practices, it wasn't until after the emergence of widespread Native resistance to the White Paper's assimilation proposal that policies geared towards the so-called reconciliation of Indigenous land and political grievances with state sovereignty began to appear. In the wake of these events, the colonial architecture that frames Indigenous state relations shifted from a structure primarily reinforced by policies, techniques, and ideologies policies, techniques, and ideologies explicitly aimed at our exclusion and assimilation to one that is now reproduced through a seemingly more conciliatory set of languages and practices which emphasize our recognition and accommodation. Regardless of this modification in the operation of colonial power, my claim is that the relationship nonetheless remains colonial to its foundation. The last 30 years of Aboriginal rights jurisprudence in Canada provides an illuminating example of this, I think. During this period, the Supreme Court of Canada has consistently refused to recognize our equal and self-determining status based on the court's adherence to precedent founded on the white supremacist myth that Indigenous societies were too primitive to bear fundamental political rights when we encountered Europeans on the continent. The notion of reconciliation advanced by the Supreme Court of Canada is entirely dependent on this racist refusal of recognition. This is perhaps most evident in the Supreme Court's interpretation of the scope and content of those Aboriginal rights recognized and affirmed in Section 35(1) of the Canadian Constitution Act of 1982. As the court states in its R versus Vanderpeet decision in 1996, and I'll quote, "The substantive rights that fall within the Constitution must be defined in light of this purpose. The Aboriginal rights recognized and affirmed in Section 35(1) must be directed towards reconciliation of the pre-existence of Aboriginal societies with the sovereignty of the Crown." Now we might ask how the court proposes to reconcile the pre-existence of Aboriginal societies with the sovereignty of the Crown. Essentially by refusing that the Aboriginal societies in question had anything akin to sovereignty worth recognizing to begin with. Instead, what the court offers up is an interpretation of Aboriginal rights as narrowly construed cultural rights that can be infringed on by the state for any number of legislative reasons, ranging from conservation to settlement to non-renewable resource development, and even to protect white interests against the potential economic fallout from recognizing Aboriginal rights to land and land-based economic pursuits. I think that this provides only one example, but an important one, a demonstration that colonial power will only recognize the collective rights and identities of Indigenous peoples, insofar as this recognition does not throw into question the background racial, legal, political, and economic framework of the colonial relationship itself. So much for the politics of recognition. Now on to reconciliation and resentment. So now I want to return to the two claims I made at the outset of my presentation. Namely, given the failure of recognition to deliver on its emancipatory promise of reconciliation, I suggest that what Nietzsche refers to scornfully as ressentiment is both an appropriate and legitimate response to settler colonization, and that under certain circumstances, maintaining a disciplined hold on our resentment can prompt the forms of self-affirmative praxis that produce decolonized forms of life that the politics of recognition and reconciliation has thus far failed to produce. Taken together, I suggest that these two claims connect with two assumptions that underwrite both Nietzsche's critique of ressentiment as well as many contemporary arguments that support state approaches to reconciliation in Indigenous contexts. The first assumption relates to how both perspectives characterize resentment as hopelessly backward-looking. Resentment, in other words, is often cast as a pathological inability to come to grips with history. And thus, spoke Zarathustra, for example, Nietzsche describes ressentiment as an expression of one's powerlessness against that which has been. Ressentiment indicates a failure to let go, or in Nietzsche's terms, to forget. To be saddled with ressentiment is to be obsessively preoccupied and incapacitated by offenses suffered in the past. Ressentiment nails the victim to the past, writes Jean Emery. It blocks the exit to the future and twists or disorders the time sense of the person that is trapped within it. Now, those familiar with the reconciliation paradigm should immediately see the similarities here. All one needs to do is recall Prime Minister's so-called apology to those who survived the attempted genocide of the Indian residential school system. By focusing narrowly on the tragedy of Indian residential schools, Harper's apology is able to frame temporally reconciliation in terms of overcoming what he called a, quote, sad chapter in our shared history. It is a way of transcending the painful legacy that has hampered our collective efforts to, quote, move on. Reconciliation is necessary to, quote, begin anew so that Indigenous peoples can start to build new partnerships together with non-Indigenous peoples on what is now unproblematically and unapologetically declared by Harper to be, quote, our land. The problem with this formulation, of course, lots of problems with this, is that insofar as this apology even implicitly addresses the question of settler colonialism, it does so, to paraphrase anthropologist Patrick Wolf, as an event and not a structure. That is, as a historical experience which occurred at some point in the distant past, but which still unfortunately continues to have negative consequences for our communities in the present. This is what happens when the conceptual and institutional tools of transitional justice are applied to the non-transitional setting of settler colonies. Where there is no period marking a clear or formal transition from an authoritarian past to a democratic present, state-sanctioned approaches to reconciliation must ideologically manufacture such a transition by allocating the abuses associated with colonization to the dustbins of history. By definition, however, there is nothing historical in the sense of being of the past about settler colonial rule. Settler colonialism is a relationship that is constituted by ongoing domination, one where interrelated facets of discursive and non-discursive power, economic, gendered, racial, and state power, have been structured into a relatively secure and resistant set of hierarchical social relationships that continue to facilitate the violent dispossession of Indigenous peoples of our lands and of our self-determining authority. In such a context, I suggest that to harbor resentment and even ressentiment, that is an intense feeling of bitter indignation towards a harm or wrongdoing, is not only an entirely defendable position, but it's actually a sign of our critical consciousness, of our sense of justice and injustice, and of our awareness of and unwillingness to reconcile ourselves with the structural and symbolic violence that is still very much a part of our lives. Now, the second assumption I would like to challenge relates more specifically to Nietzsche's characterization of ressentiment as an entirely reactive, as opposed to active mode of comportment. According to Nietzsche, one of the most perverse features of the, quote, man of ressentiment is that in order to exist at all, he first needs a, quote, hostile external world. His very identity and actions depends, writes Nietzsche, on external stimuli in order to act at all. His action is fundamentally reaction. It is this subject-forming reactive positioning to settler colonialism that I take Tyagi Alfred and Jeff Korntassel to identify when they warn of the, quote, danger in allowing colonization to be the only story in Indigenous people's lives, where colonial power becomes the, quote, fundamental reference and assumption against which Indigenous subjectivities are constructed and our conceptions of freedom understood. On this point, I have once again garnered much insight from the work of Fanon. Understanding Fanon's views regarding the political significance of what he called emotional factors in the formation of anti-colonial subjectivities and struggle requires that we briefly revisit his theory of internalized colonialism. Recall that for Fanon, in contexts where the reproduction of colonial rule, and I get this in the article of mine that I sent out, where the reproduction of colonial rule does not rely solely on force, it requires the production of what he liked to call colonized subjects that acquiesce to the forms of power that have been imposed on them. Internalization thus occurs when the social relations of colonization, along with the forms of recognition and representation that serve to legitimate them, come to be seen as true or natural to the colonized themselves. Under such condition, colonial domination appears, for Fanon, quote, more subtle, less bloody. For Fanon, this, quote, psychological economic structure is what produces the condition of stagnancy and inertia that characterizes what he sees in the colonial world. The Wretched of the Earth, for example, is littered with passages that highlight the fundamentally passive and lethargic condition that the colonial situation produces. The colonial world, writes Fanon, is, quote, compartmentalized, Manichaean, and petrified. It is a world in which the colonial subject remains, quote, penned in, lies, quote, coiled and robbed, taught to, quote, remain in his place and not overstep his limits. In Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon describes this Manichaean relationship as locked or fixed by the assumption of racial and cultural inferiority and superiority held by the colonizer and colonized respectively. Unlike racist arguments that attribute the supposed inertia of colonized societies to the cultural and technological underdevelopment of the colonized themselves, Fanon identifies the colonial social structure as the source of this immobility and domination. Now, although the internalized negative energy produced by what Fanon calls this hostile situation will first express itself against the colonized, quote, own people, this is the period when black turns on black, writes Fanon, when colonial violence assumes a black or Arab face. Over time, it will begin to incite a negative reaction in the colonized subject. It is my claim that this reaction indicates a breakdown of the psychological structure of internalized colonialism. The colonized subject, impoverished and abused, begins to look at the colonists' world of, quote, lights and paved roads with envy, contempt, and resentment. The colonized begin to desire what has been denied them, land, freedom, and dignity. They begin dreaming of revenge, of taking their, quote, oppressor's place. Now, although Fanon is quick to insist that this legitimate desire for revenge, born of the colonized nascent, quote, hatred and resentment toward the colonists, cannot alone nurture a struggle for freedom, I suggest that these negative emotions nonetheless mark an important turning point in the individual and collective coming to consciousness of the colonized. More specifically, I think that they represent the externalization of that which was previously internalized, a purging, if you will, of the so-called inferiority complex of the colonized subject. In the context of internalized colonialism, the material conditions of poverty and violence that condition the colonial situation appear muted to the colonized because they are seen as the product of one's own cultural deficiencies. In such a context, the formation of what Fanon calls a colonial enemy, i.e. a source external to ourselves that we come to associate with, quote, our misfortunes, signifies an important collapse of this internalized psychic structure. For Fanon, only once this rupture has occurred, or to use Jean Amarie's phrase, and he's speaking about Fanon right now, only once these sterile emotions come to recognize themselves for what they truly are, consequences of social repression, can the colonized then cast their, quote, exasperated hatred and rage in this new direction, to quote Fanon again. Fanon insists that these reactive emotions can also prompt the colonized to revalue and affirm those cultural traditions and social practices that are systematic. After years of dehumanization, the colonized begin to resent the assumed, quote, superior or supremacy of white values that have served to ideologically justify their continued exploitation and domination. In the period of decolonization, writes Fanon, the colonized masses thumb their noses up at these very values, shower them with insults, and vomit them up. Eventually, this newfound resentment of colonial values prompts the colonized to affirm the worth of their own traditions, of their own civilizations, which in turn generates feelings of pride and self-certainty unknown in the colonial period. For Fanon, this, quote, determination to defend one's skin is characteristic of the colonized response to colonial oppression and provides them with the motivating, quote, reason to join the struggle. Although Fanon ultimately saw this example of indigenous cultural empowerment as an expression akin to Nietzschean ressentiment, that is, as a limited reaction to colonial power, he nonetheless claimed it as necessary for the same reason he affirmed the transformative potential of emotional factors like anger and resentment. They signify for Fanon an important break in the forms of colonial subjection that have hitherto kept the colonized in their place. In the context of and I'm concluding here briefly, in the context of internalized colonialism then, it would appear that the emergence of reactive emotions like anger and resentment can indicate a breakdown of colonial subjection and thus open up the very possibility of generating forms of transformative anti-colonial praxis that are required to break out of what he called the Manichaean delirium of our colonial situation. by uprooting the structural injustices that produce resenting colonized subjects in the first place. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Paul Tetro. My question is, in the current movement now, the Indigenous movement, do you see these, I guess you call it two tendencies, reflected, and how do you see them reflected? How are they playing out?
Which two tendencies?
Well, the tendency to understand the importance of resentment on one hand, and the tendency to reconcile and go in that mode.
Yeah.
On the other, and how they play out, or do they play out?
No, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that because I was like finishing this book project over the break, the holiday break, and the I Little No More stuff kind of broke out. And what I've characterized it as, and which it was characterized, the history that I Little No More is just the latest incarnation with, has been a history of these cycles of struggle where Indigenous transformative agency and direct action and so forth has been attempted to be placated by the state through gestures of recognition and reconciliation, but which have just been structurally inadequate and also just like bullshit, false promises. So this generates a new cycle of escalating Indigenous militancy and direct action that is really fueled by Indigenous people's frustration and resentment towards an ongoing settler colonial situation in the wake of a promise that it would be changed by institutions of power. So I think that when you saw I Will No More come out, a lot of media representations just didn't understand what Indians were all angry about, because they're given these forms of recognition, whether it's constitutional recognition in the form of rights, recognition of land interests in the form of land claims or the modern treaty process, or whatever. So I think that the kind of the generative creative character of these expressions of anger and resentment has produced what we see in the I Will No More movement and previous generations of Indigenous activism and militancy. And it's also, and this is important, what the discourse of recognition and reconciliation emerges from above in order to placate and pacify. And we've seen that in roughly four cycles since 1969. The first cycle emerging in response to the absolute explosion of Indigenous activism after the White Paper, and what the federal government does is offer recognition of Aboriginal land rights, and then eventually recognition of Aboriginal and treaty rights in the Constitution in 1982. After 1982, that recognition fell flat, and the federal government did nothing to fill out or define the scope and content of those rights. And then you see like an explosion of escalating Indigenous nationalism and disruptive direct actions across the country, shutting down the province here in BC throughout the 90s through roadblocks, and a number of these types of projects across the country until we get to Oka in 1990, and it explodes in that a spectacular display of violence by the state. And then you have another gesture come in with the establishment of the most expensive Royal Commission on History, which attempts to kind of unpack the problem of this relationship and calls for, as a framework, to restructure relationships premised on mutual recognition, sharing, responsibility, and that's it. Guess what happened to RCAP? It just got shelved. It sat there gathering dust, and you have the kind of just another cycle of Indigenous resistance emerge through the 1990s. You have Gustus and Lake, all these sorts of things. You have Indigenous peoples now taking their experiences in residential schools and suing the hell out of Canada for the abuses that they suffer in there, and then it prompts another court-sanctioned approach to reconciliation in the form of the apology and the Indian residential school settlement. And that recent sting has fallen absolutely on its face, with the federal government's it's just words, and then proceed to institute in a very aggressive form this new colonial legislation in the form of Bill C-45. So we're seeing that cycle happen again. What I think is different this time is that we're on to this ebb and flow of resistance and these just bullshit forms of attempted accommodation. And it's proving itself less easy to co-opt what we're seeing now in these vacant gestures of reconciliation and recognition. Yeah.
My name's Patrick. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on your underlying concept of freedom. In your article that was posted online, you criticized this way, I think you basically call it the liberal politics of recognition of Taylor. And then you say that resentment is basically not just negative, it's also productive. And you use that to kind of prompt sort of another kind of politics of recognition with Fanon, kind of, where you said that basically reflecting on your history and etc., you can kind of find this new something that you can rally around, sort of. But I'm wondering if that is really so different in terms of like the pattern of, it's kind of a kind of recognition politics, is it not? Where in the Fanon case, you are sort of coming to terms with this new aspect of yourself that you didn't necessarily recognize, but now you valorize it and you sort of seek a new kind of recognition through that. And I'm wondering how that's different from Taylor's perspective. And just, you also mentioned, I thought this was interesting, in the settler colonial context, that there's a certain political pattern that can't be avoided unless it becomes a more democratic institution in the first place. So for instance, if the Canadian Constitution or state is less colonial in character and suddenly more democratic, that suddenly this might prompt a new kind of freedom or something like that. So,
well, there's a number of things in there. It's not actually, and explicitly with a call following Fanon, but more just kind of my political sensibilities, a turn away from the state. So I want to break out of that structure of politics of recognition premised on demanding these colonial institutions in a very unreasonable way to change their colonial patterns of behavior and conduct. I think that just is like, that's not how my understanding of power, how it works. And the other thing is, I don't eschew entirely some of the insights from the recognition literature. One of the assumptions within the literature is that our subjectivities are constructed intersubjectively through our relationships with other, and I would extend that to include our relationships with non-human others, with place, with a bunch of other things inform who we are. And then the more kind of normative argument in the recognition is saying that the characters of those relationships have an impact on ourselves as free agents. So I agree with the first argument, the intersubjectivity thesis. I agree partially with the second thesis, that the character of our relationships can impact whether or not we are free or dominated subjects. I disagree with the means by which that gets articulated in politics as this demand from a subaltern to a hegemon, with the assumption that the granting of recognition is going to produce this condition of freedom. Now, Fanon thinks it a bit differently. He sees self-recognition as not necessarily only entailing this battle between master and slave, but looks at the intersubjective relationships that both inform our identities, but also create the condition of possibility for freedom or vice versa domination as being multi-dimensional. So we find ourselves empowered and our identities informed in qualitatively different ways through our own communities of struggle, our own cultural communities, and so on. And Fanon sees that form of self-recognition on the part of the colonized as an important generator of praxis that might effect a struggle that is attentive to the structural conditions of colonial rule. So to get back at your first question, my kind of theory of freedom is a practice-oriented one where these kind of self-recognitive, this self-fashioning is also deployed within and against various forms of colonial power that are producing our subjectified sort of states of existence. It would akin slightly, without going too much into it, on kind of an ethics or practice of freedom, a radicalized version of what Foucault might have been talking about in this later period.
Over here. So first of all your conclusions regarding resentment and anger, I think, are very powerful and very important. So I'm not in any way questioning those arguments or theses. But what I'm curious about, from my standpoint as a settler ally, I participated in More, Occupy, alongside many First Nations protesters and activists. And what I'm curious about, and what I'm wondering if you could problematize a bit, is how the status of a white settler ally would fit into a politics at least partly governed by these emotions of resentment and anger towards the colonists.
Well, the first response is usually this, the type of visceral resentment that I don't want to affirm, which is just like a belligerent affirmation of whiteness and an anger towards Indigenous peoples for being treated unfair, or being getting more than they deserve, sort of thing. So you'll want to, or I would want to, and I do distinguish between the forms of kind of the types of resentment that I would want to affirm and the types that I don't. And there's a number of ways you can do that. In the kind of moral kind of philosophy of like Rawls and others, you have to articulate that through a display of public reason. And you have to justify that the empirical condition of the world, the injustice, is there through this articulation of reason, therefore legitimizing the subjective state of anger or resentment. And I don't like that approach. So what I'm more interested is in a kind of a dialogical attempt that tries to understand what generates these kind of emotional reactions, but then the types of effects that they produce in terms of like identities and forms of struggle, and whether they're dealing with the generative conditions of colonial sections, whatever forms of rule that you're talking about. The other aspect is there's just an assumption that that because Indigenous people might harbor these emotional responses, that forecloses the possibility of reconciliation, and I think that that's not the case, and it's been patently demonstrated to not be the case in words and deeds by Indigenous peoples historically to the present. The other problem is the problem, and that's the generation of these actually problematic forms of resentment by settler Canadians. I've just been responding more to these sorts of critiques in the context of I'll Know More, and I've kind of come to the conclusion that that's more or less inevitable that you're going to have that response. What I Don't Know More and movements like it have in their sights is the colonial relationship between Indigenous peoples and the state, predicated on our ongoing dispossession and usurpation of our sovereign authority. That essentially means that what we have in our sights are questions of land and authority that have been unjustly dispossessed from us, stolen from us, and it's going to require to have some of that given back. And that is going to inevitably upset people and strain relationships, but it's what a authentic sort of kind of maneuver towards authentic reconciliation and justice would look like here. What we'll have to do is form those relationships with people who are already kind of see themselves in this struggle as well as either the other half of a treaty obligation, or because they see their interests represented perhaps more through Indigenous struggle than the interests of the state, which is shown to be just a mouthpiece for industry in very destructive ways. So.
I'm just kind of curious in looking at models that represent success in these kind of outcomes. So if I'm a social worker, and so I don't know a lot about history, and I don't know a lot about anthropology, but I kind of look at, I had a sociology professor that was from Ireland, and I started looking at the Catholic Protestant kind of, in there was a conflict over land and rights and so forth, and I started looking at the feminist kind of issue and where you get some allies there, and I'm just trying to say, do you see within your breadth of knowledge a model that has run some success? I understand from my background in undergraduate psychology of internalization and externalization and building on self-esteem to kind of ground one in their own rights. But I'm just, do you see any models of success in the world and in history that has led to what the overall goal is of sovereignty and so forth?
In those big, well, I think it's like we see, insofar as like even like a quite a hostile or what might be seen as problematic expression of Indigenous anger and resentment is indicating this breakdown of this internalization and the formulation of a problem that is external to oneself is, I think, profound, like is itself a success. In the sense that you no longer live your life thinking that you're the product of your own misery, because that's what all these racist discourses have violently beaten into you. So we have to think of success not just as, oh, this produced an alternative, because those alternatives are generally hard to come by in this world. But you can see where there has been moments where the forms of practice and cultural activities that have been born of this kind of these emotional responses have produced lasting effects and have targeted or been directed towards true sources of our oppression. So if you look at, like I answered for that first question, if you look at the history of kind of anger and frustration fueled direct action that occurred in the 1980s across Canada was a real sort of it generated senses of solidarity and the resurgence of cultural practices that were being practiced in communities against sexism, the state and capital in ways that were effective to the degree that it forced the state to react. It had these forms of practice or these emotional responses were generating types of direct action which were effectively putting their finger on the pulse of two pillars of colonial sovereignty. That's on the one hand, the monopoly on the use of violence. So violence was off the question during that period of time. Youth would at least open to the conversation that violence might be used to achieve political ends, whether we agree or not. It definitely upsets the state when you claim that as your own right, rather than the exclusive jurisdiction of the state. And then challenging the dictates of the accumulation of capital through direct action that was blocking flows of capital entering or leaving, Indigenous communities through widespread economic disruption. I think that the effects that had both in the constitution of alternative Indigenous subjectivities and in what it was compelling the state to do have to be seen as victories in the struggle. And then you have this apparatus of recognition being kind of granted to Indigenous peoples, and you have a moment of a lull, but we recognize that it's just words, vacant promises, and then you have this resurgent activity emerge again, which is where we're in a cycle of that right now. Yeah.
So I wonder, I mean, and I think this last comment sort of brings this up. I wonder if your own argument is a little bit stuck here. It sounds like you want to promote the anger and the resentment, which I get and completely support, but at the same time, you want to achieve an authentic recognition or an authentic reconciliation through some kind of dialogue, which seems very hard for me to square those competing impulses. So I wonder, why don't you just bail on the whole thing with recognition and reconciliation? The whole idea of that is so dubious from the beginning, simply because of the prefix "re." If it's, there's no "re" there, because since it was always subaltern, there's no getting back to any kind of state, right? And dialogue, I mean, come on. Right?
I didn't say any of that, though.
You said dialogic, you were looking for a dialogic relation there, just in your comments.
Yeah, but I'm not asking it to be mediated through relations of recognition through state or capital, for instance. But I think that we can have, more dialogical relations that aren't premised on this status form of recognition or reconciliation politics.
But why not just let the anger, expose the anger and pursue the anger through, as you said, more direct forms of intervention, blocking flows, violent interventions, and I'm thinking of, on the one hand, the civil rights movement in the 60s in the US, and on the other hand, Gandhi's movement in India, various forms of violent, non-violent intervention that sort of bring fear to the people. And here's where, your sources could help you. In the Hegel master-slave bit, the whole thing hinges on struggle to the death, right, between the competing forces. And I take that to mean provoking mortal fear in different sides, right? And then the Nietzsche bit, Nietzsche actually
Same with
says...
Fanon, that's what, recognition, and that's what's so fucking weird about Taylor, is that is left out of, the struggle to the death is left out of the politics of recognition, and his use of Fanon just wants to abandon the whole, specter of violence.
Yeah, he just covers it over, Taylor. He just acts like everybody's going to be fine. But on the other hand, with Nietzsche, you're right, he's got resentment in a little bit of a box, but he also, in the genealogy, says, look, resentment is what fueled this, what he calls the slave revolt of the priests that overcame their master morality, right? So it seems to me there's an explicitly revolutionary dimension to your project here that would offer a clearer, more direct, more emphatic alternative to the discourse of reconciliation in any form, because reconciliation, it seems to me, as you've shown, is always going to end up as lost.
Yeah, I still think that there's something to a conception of reconciliation. And we can't just just use the term to kind of as a catch-all for all. I opened with 3 explicit meanings of reconciliation as it plays out in Canada. One is the kind of relation to self. Indigenous people might refer to this as in the language of healing. There's the reconciliation of political relationships between 2 antagonistic forces, I still hold out the hope that we are able to relate to one another in more reconciled terms in that sort of way. I don't hold any hope for that being mediated through dominant institutions, economic or political. And I think, and this is where, and this is a book, so this is where I think that Indigenous kind of practices and theories have a lot to offer, whether it's through practices of treaty making, through or what have you. But I don't think the discourse I'm not affirming is the one that sees these things mediated through these very problematic sites of power. And I agree with you. I think that this has to be done through a very assertive display of force, whether or not that's violent in the sense that Fanon speaks of it, or it's like an assertion that is profoundly unsettling to dominant relations of power through forms of direct action or whatever. The other thing which is different from, I think, both the civil rights and the Gandhi example is that we're a radical minority on this territory because of the effects of settler colonialism and genocide. So we also do have to position ourselves in relationships in order to in order to survive, I think. So the question of that's where I think that a dialogue is still important, because we have to forge those relationships in a context of being radically minor in relationship to the dominant society.
The problematic sides of power, which you just mentioned, in terms of language, and I recognize that we're speaking in English and language is the foreigner, the master, the colonial, and that. Can you speak a little bit to ways of claiming agency and identity amongst First Nations people that's outside of the hegemonic ideas of language, in terms of, say, dance, which has been a feature of I don't know more, and drumming?
Well, it's a tough one, because as soon as I open my mouth, I'm already in a performative contradiction. I draw on in the larger work, I draw on a really generative sort, or a critical sort of, I call it I had to have some stamp of my own in this, so I called it, it's a grounded normativity. So it's an ethics that is based on land-based practices and long-standing experiential knowledge, which Indigenous peoples draw on in their practices and in the formation of their relationships with others, human and non-human, over time. So it's a relation of recognition of sorts, but stripped of its anthropocentrism and drawn off of these relational place-based ethics. And I draw on my own community to kind of explore what that means when that relational land, place-based grounded normativity gets used and really deployed in a really informative critique of both capital and state, and used to think of a contemporary institutionalization of what a just relationship might be. Where we went wrong is that we thought we could negotiate that. And it drew the energy away from actualization of those practices through practicing to attempting to articulate them in language to these institutions of power, with the assumption that if our arguments were grounded enough, that those institutions would change their colonial patterns of behavior. So it got sucked away from a practice to a framework which is now focus more on negotiations. So that's, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's one way in the larger project that I try and articulate an Indigenous alternative to it, which is grounded in my own community's knowledge and experiences.
I appreciate that. And Jeff Contasso also has that.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess my question is, I'm Vlad. What kind of ressentiment is one that limits itself? How can subject that's experiencing ressentiment reify his or her own ressentiment? You seem to be separating means from ends and saying these are our means ressentiment, and our ends are different from the violence implicit in ressentiment. Our ends are equality, peace, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's a hard one because in Fanon, and I take my insights on resentment and ressentiment from Fanon, and I think even historically you could look at this as like he admits that like when he's speaking of like movements like negritude or identity, like anti-colonial cultural politics of its day, as being informed by something akin to the reactive stance that Nietzsche referred to as ressentiment. And I think that there's something to that argument. What I think is problematic in Fanon is that he did see it. Like part of the problematization was these practices born of these emotional reactions to settler colonialization or colonization were insufficient as an end. They're just a trigger that, like what he said, it's like it mobilizes them to fight, but then it's got to immediately transcend itself in this new man or new humanism or whatever. So I make the argument that Fanon actually treats it really instrumentally, where I treat that the kind of the self-affirmative practices that can be generated by ressentiment as substantive and can inform alternatives to like the colonial social relationships. So I don't treat these affirmations of the cultural politics of anti-colonial struggle as just instrumental. I think that they are and can generate ends. So the instrumental reading, the means-ends distinction, I think is more in Fanon than what I'm talking about. Fanon essentially treats cultural politics like Marxist treats class politics. He sees it as soon as you formulate, once a class moves from just an objective structural thing in relationship to a means of production and becomes seen as a class and then generates practices that are the conditions that would uproot its identity as a class, Fanon applies that to kind of to identity politics. He sees it as a mobilizing force that once it comes to identify itself as such, will then proceed to transcend that in struggle. I don't see that way. I think that the practices born of our resentment are substantive, not instrumental.
So do we ever end resentment?
I think we can lessen it when the conditions that produce it are dissipated. And until then, it's going to be, like I say, I think I formally believe that it's something that we ignore at our peril for false conciliatorianness because it's an indicator, maybe not even disclosed to us at times. That's the tricky thing about resentment, is that it's not often either disclosed to us or honest about its source.